It's a selective history. It's just a few pieces of that puzzle Luke chose to include. And as a historian, I try to be as objective as possible and try to do a critical understanding and reading, interpretation of the evidence that's there.
A lot of what was known about John the Baptist in the first century has been lost because it was not convenient for Christianity to remember too much. There are little clues here and there about what John was really up to. But in a way we have to bracket out what scholars call the apologetic texts, which make John safe.
For so many people, history is not about primary source documents. It's not about empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told. It's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down over a generation. Loyalty takes precedence over truth.
The Barabbas story, history, propaganda, or theology. I recently came across a Christian YouTuber discussing the story of Barabbas and the trial before Pontius Pilate. His takeaway was familiar. The crowd chose a violent Messiah over a peaceful Jesus. And to him, that was the moral of the story. But that interpretation assumes something important, that the gospel narrative is straightforward history, rather than a text shaped by theology, politics, and persuasion. And that's where things get more complicated. Because what if the Barabbas story isn't just reporting an event, but reframing one? To understand this, we have to step back into the 1st century. Judea was under Roman occupation. Rebellions were common. Crucifixion wasn't rare. It was Rome's standard punishment for insurgents, rebels, and those seen as threats to imperial order. And that matters, because the Gospels themselves acknowledge that Jesus was crucified, a punishment typically reserved for political rebellion. So the question becomes, how do later writers explain that to a growing non-Jewish Roman audience? Some scholars argue that the Barabbas episode functions less like a courtroom transcript and more like a theological and political contrast. Barabbas, whose name can mean son of the Father, is portrayed as a violent rebel. Jesus is presented as the peaceful alternative. The crowd chooses the rebel. Rome in this telling appears almost reluctant. Pilate is hesitant, even sympathetic, and responsibility shifts away from Roman authority and toward a Jewish crowd. That shift is significant. After the destruction of Jerusalem in the First Jewish-Roman War and the fall of the Temple in 70 CE, the political landscape changed dramatically. Jewish resistance had been crushed. Any movement associated with rebellion was dangerous. For a growing Christian movement trying to survive and expand within the Roman world, distancing Jesus from revolutionary violence wasn't just theological, it was strategic. In that light, the Barabbas story can be read as a kind of parable, a narrative that says, don't choose the militant path, don't resist Rome, choose the figure who accommodates rather than fights. Whether or not that was the original message of Jesus is another question entirely. Because when you look closely at the Gospels, you don't just find one consistent portrayal, you find tension. On one hand, teachings about turning the other cheek and loving enemies. On the other, moments of confrontation, temple disruption, apocalyptic warnings, bold challenges to authority. These aren't easily harmonized, and that's why many scholars suggest the Gospels are layered texts built from earlier traditions, later interpretations, and post-war concerns. Even the portrayal of Roman authority is telling. Take Pontius Pilate. Historically, he was known as a harsh governor, yet in the Gospels he often appears hesitant, even reluctant to execute Jesus. That softer portrayal may reflect the needs of a later audience living in under Roman rule. And then there's how figures like Barabbas are depicted in modern retellings. In films like The Passion of the Christ, Barabbas is often portrayed as grotesque or animalistic, almost a caricature of violence and chaos. But historically, that image is questionable. Many of the rebels crucified by Rome weren't mindless criminals. They were driven by conviction. National, religious, or both. If you've seen Braveheart, you know how differently a rebel can be framed, not as a brute, but as a courageous freedom fighter. Perspective shapes the story. And here's the irony. It's entirely possible that both Jesus and figures like Barabbas existed in a world of resistance, tension, and courage under imperial domination. But the gospel narratives, as they developed, had reasons to draw a sharp distinction. Jesus could not remain easily associated with rebellion, at least not for a movement spreading through the Roman Empire. He had to become something else, a figure acceptable to a broader Gentile audience, a figure whose death could be interpreted not as a failed uprising, but as a meaningful, even necessary act within a theological framework. None of this means the Gospels have no historical value, but it does mean they require careful reading. They are not just records of events, they are interpretations of events, shaped by communities navigating power, survival, and identity. So when someone says, the crowd chose a violent Messiah over a peaceful one, it's worth asking, is that what happened? Or is that how the story was told, later, for a reason? Because understanding these texts isn't just about accepting the narrative, it's about asking why the narrative was shaped the way it was, and what that tells us about history, power, and belief.
I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier, because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. The Spirit of the Lord God is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives and freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn,